Welcome to the Sci-fi Rancher story. Here you find the best sci-fi story written by human. Listen the story. If you like it, subscribe the channel.
The cold bit deep, a slow and deliberate. Thief stealing warmth from his bones, he awoke with the weight of frost clinging. To his lashes the taste of iron thick, in his mouth darkness stretched overhead. Vast and endless, the sky fractured with unfamiliar constellations, stars swirled. In patterns he did not recognize, their faint glows swallowed by the vast. Indifference of the void pain pulsed through his limbs, dull at first, then sharper as sensation crawled back into his body. He tried to move, but his muscles resisted, stiff and aching. A low breath slipped from his lips, turning to mist in the alien air. The ground beneath him was uneven, jagged like shards of broken glass, smoothed only by time and wind, a wasteland silent save for the distant whisper of something shifting in the darkness. How long had he been here? The thought came slow, thick with confusion. His mind grasped at fragment, at half-formed memories that dissolved like sand between his fingers. He remembered hands, slender, graceful. Inhuman hands, the brush of cold fingertips against his skin, a voice, distant, saying something he couldn't quite piece together. And then nothing, only the suffocating blackness of unconsciousness. His breath hitched. She had left him here. The realization struck like a blade to the gut. The alien woman, tall, elegant, her gaze unreadable, had abandoned him to die in this vast, unfeeling wilderness. But why? He forced himself to move, pushing against the stiff resistance of his body. Every motion sent a jolt of agony through his limbs, but he gritted his teeth and sat up, eyes adjusting to the dim glow of the distant moons. The world around him was barren, an expanse of shattered rock and life dunes, stretching into infinity. In the distance, jagged peaks clawed at the sky, their edges sharp as knives. The wind howled through them, a spectral sound that carried no warmth, no promise of life. His hands dug into the dirt, fingers brushing over something smooth, something unnatural. He looked down and saw a streak of metal beneath. The dust burned, half buried but unmistakably part of something larger, a wreck. He wasn't alone when he arrived here. The thought sent a fresh surge of unease crawling through him. Had she crashed with him? Had they both fallen from the sky only for her to wake first and leave him behind? Or had she brought him here, conscious and aware, and simply walked away? His jaw clenched, his body trembled from cold or anger. He wasn't sure. A sharp sound cut through the silence, a distant crack like something brittle snapping beneath unseen weight. He froze, heart pounding against his ribs. The sound had come from beyond the dunes, from the shifting shadows that stretched across the land. He wasn't alone. Slowly, he pushed himself onto unsteady feet, forcing air into his lungs. He took a step forward, then another, testing the strength of his limbs. Pain lanced through him with each movement, but he ignored it. He had no other choice. He needed to move. He needed to survive. And most of all, he needed to know why she had left him here. The wind howled through the barren expanse, a hollow sound that curled around the jagged peaks like a whisper of something ancient. The sky above him stretched on, vast and unknowable, its colors shifting subtly between shades of deep indigo and silver-tinged violet. The constellations were unfamiliar, unrecognizable to anything he had ever known. The realization settled in his gut like lead. Wherever he was, it was not home. He took another step forward, muscles protesting with each movement. But he forced himself to keep going. The wreckage behind him loomed like a skeleton picked clean by time, jagged metal jutting from the dirt like broken ribs. The air here was thinner than he was used to, yet breathable, filling his lungs with an unsettling crispness, tinged faintly with something metallic. He tried not to think about what that meant. Survival first, questions later. His boots crunched against the fractured ground, the surface rough and uneven. It was neither sand nor stone, but something else entirely, something that felt brittle beneath his weight, yet refused to break. The deeper he moved into the landscape, the more he began to notice the unnatural stillness. There was no rustling of unseen creatures, No chirping of insects, no distant hum of water or wind through trees, only silence. Vast and consuming, and yet he knew he was being watched. The feeling clawed at the back of his mind, an instinct older than reason. He scanned the horizon, but there was nothing but the endless stretch of lifeless terrain, no movement. No figures, just the eerie sense that something unseen lurked just beyond his sight. Then a flicker, a shadow shifting. Against the farthest ridge he stopped. Breath caught in his throat, his pulse pounded in his ears as he strained his vision, waiting, watching there. Again something or someone moved along the ridge, its form barely distinguishable from the rocky terrain. It was not the alien woman. He knew that much instantly. The way it moved was different, more deliberate, less graceful. It was taller than her, broader, and it was not alone. A second figure emerged from the darkness beside it, then a third. They were watching him. He swallowed hard, instincts wearing between fight and flight. He had no weapons, no way to defend himself if they decided to close the distance. The air around them seemed to shimmer slightly, as if the very space they occupied was unstable, a distortion brief, but undeniable. He took a cautious step back. Heart hammering, the figures did not move closer. They simply remained on the ridge. Their presence an unspoken threat. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they melted back into the landscape, vanishing into the shifting shadows of the dunes. He exhaled shakily, his breath misting in the cold. Who were they? The thought gored at him as he pressed forward, his unease growing with each step. The land stretched ahead, vast and indifferent, but now it no longer felt empty. It felt inhabited, and that meant he wasn't just stranded, he was being hunted. The air grew heavier as he pressed forward, the cold biting deeper, cutting through the layers of fabric that barely shielded his skin. The landscape was a wasteland of jagged rock and silent dunes, an ocean of shifting shadows that stretched endlessly in all directions. The figures on the ridge had vanished, but their presence lingered in his mind, a knowing unease he couldn't shake. He wasn't alone here, and that meant danger. His legs ached from the uneven terrain, the sharp incline forcing him to climb with careful, deliberate steps. He didn't know where he was going, only that stopping was not an option. To stay in one place felt like an invitation, an admission of weakness. He had seen the way they had watched him, standing just at the edge of sight. They had not approached, not yet. A decision. Were they waiting for him to fall, to weaken, or were they testing him, seeing how far he would go before he realized the truth, that he didn't belong here, that he was already as good as dead? The thought sent a fresh wave of defiance through him. He wouldn't die out here, not like this, not abandoned and forgotten on a world that swallowed its secrets whole. He clenched his fists, pushing his body forward. Each step was a battle, the frozen ground offering no mercy. Then the silence broke. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the landscape, like the earth itself had just exhaled. It came from beneath him, vibrating through the ground. The brittle surface trembled, and suddenly he felt himself sinking. His breath hitched too late. The rock beneath him gave way, splitting apart, and the world dropped out from under him. Gravity seized him, yanking him down into the darkness. His arms flailed, fingers scraping against jagged edges of stone. As he tumbled through the chasm, the wind roared past his ears, the cold rushing up to meet him. Then impact, sharp, sudden. His body collided with something hard, knocking the breath from his lungs. He lay still, stunned, pain flaring in every nerve. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't safe either. Above the opening he had fallen through was a sliver of dim light, impossibly far away. The walls around him were smooth, unnatural, as though this space had not been shaped by time and erosion, but by something else, something deliberate. A sound, not wind, not stone shifting, something else, breathing shallow, measured, not his. The realization crawled up his spine like ice. He wasn't alone. Down here something moved in the darkness. The darkness pressed in around him, thick and absolute. He could hear nothing beyond the slow, deliberate sound of breathing, not his own, but something else's. It came from deep within the cavern, from the unseen recesses where the dim light could not reach. He lay still, barely daring to move, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The air was thick with dust, carrying a faint metallic scent, like old blood and rusted Iron his fingers scraped against the cold stone beneath him as he shifted, testing the limits of his injury's pain. Flared in his side, sharp and deep, a bruise at best, a fracture at worst. He clenched his teeth and forced himself up, onto his elbows, tilting his head toward the source of the sound, the breathing. Stopped silence swallowed the cavern. Once more he held his breath, every muscle in his body rigid, the silence stretched, unbearable in its weight, and then movement, slow, deliberate, something shifting against the stone, not an animal, not the wind, something thinking, watching. His eyes strained in the darkness, his mind racing through possibilities. The figures he had seen earlier, were they down here too? Had they been waiting for him to fall, or was this something different? Entirely a whisper, not a voice, not words. Just a thread of sound slithering through the air like the echo of something ancient. His blood turned to ice, and then suddenly the cavern wasn't empty anymore. A faint pulsing glow flickered to life in the distance. Not a single light, but several small, shifting like embers floating in water. They hovered in the air, their soft illumination revealing glimpses of what lay hidden in the dark. He saw the outline of massive curving structures, embedded in the walls, their surfaces smooth and unnaturally precise. Symbols, intricate and unfamiliar, glowed faintly across their surfaces, pulsing with a slow rhythm, as if breathing. And there, standing just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure, not one of the watchers from the ridge, not the alien woman, something else. Its silhouette was impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and sharp. It did not move, did not breathe, but he could feel it watching him, studying him. Then a voice, not spoken aloud, not a whisper in the air, a voice in his mind. You were not meant to survive. A jolt of cold shot through his spine. He scrambled back instinctively, his boots scraping against the stone. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his heartbeat a wild, unsteady thing. The figure did not move, but the voice came again, deeper this time. You were left here for a reason. His mind raced, grasping for answers, for meaning. Was this why the alien woman had abandoned him? Not out of cruelty, not out of necessity, but because something had ordered it. Had she known this thing was down here? Had she known what it would do to him? His pulse thundered as the truth settled into his chest like a stone. She hadn't just left him to die, she had sacrificed him. And now whatever had been waiting in the darkness was ready to claim him. A terrible stillness settled over the cavern, the glow from the strange symbols pulsed slow and deliberate, like the measured heartbeat of something vast and ancient. He could feel them, not just see them, but feel them in a way that unsettled his very sense of reality. The air had changed, it had weight now, a density that pressed against his skin, as if the cavern itself was alive, as if it was breathing along with those flickering lights. The figure standing at the edge of the glow had not moved, it remained an unmoving shadow, its elongated form blending with the darkness beyond, its presence more felt than seen. You were not meant to survive. The words still echoed inside his skull, and he couldn't tell if they had truly been spoken or if they had simply unfurled within his own mind like a foreign thought inserted where it didn't belong. His breath was uneven, his ribs expanding with shallow, frantic inhales. He forced himself to remain still, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee into the tunnels behind him, to put distance between himself and whatever had spoken. But another part of him, a deeper, more primal awareness, understood something crucial. Running would change nothing. He had fallen into something far older than himself, something vast and deliberate. He had been abandoned here, left in the hands of whatever this presence was, and the moment he had stepped foot in this place, he had become a part of it. His mind clawed for understanding. Who or what was this thing before him, and why had she, the alien woman, left him here to face it? Had she been afraid? Had she known what awaited him in the dark? He swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. Finally, he forced himself to speak, his voice raw and edged with caution. "What are you?" The air vibrated in response, a low resonance thrumming through the cavern walls. The figure did not move, but the symbols burned brighter for a fleeting moment, their glow illuminating its edges. It was taller than he had first thought, its limbs long and jagged, its presence unsettlingly still. Then the voice returned, "We are the ones left Behind the words carried weight pressing against his skull, unraveling inside his thoughts in a way that felt deeply unnatural. He shuddered, his fingers twitching against the stone. The ones left behind. His voice was horror, barely a whisper. By who? The silence stretched. Then, for the first time, the figure shifted, not a step, not a breath, just a subtle tilting of its head, as though considering the question. Then an answer by those who feared what we would become. Something inside him clenched at the words. There was history in them. Grief maybe, or rage, a deep and festering thing that had waited in the dark for longer than he could comprehend. And then something worse, a realization slithered through his gut like ice. The alien woman hadn't just abandoned him, she had fed him to something. For what purpose he didn't yet know, but the presence before him was not indifferent. It was patient, it was waiting, and whatever it was waiting for, he was at the center of it. The cavern pulsed around him, alive with an unseen force that coiled through the air like an invisible current. The glowing symbols burned brighter now, their strange patterns shifting as though they were reacting to his presence, recognizing him or claiming him. The figure before him remained still, its elongated limbs barely distinguishable from the darkness beyond the light's reach. It did not breathe, it did not blink. It was like a statue of something long dead, or something that had never been alive to begin with. But the voice in his mind was very much alive. You were left for us. The words pressed against his skull, filling the empty spaces between his thoughts, sinking into him like something that had always been there, something waiting for him to understand. His pulse roared in his ears. Why? His voice was horror, raw with fear and frustration. Why did she leave me? The air in the cavern vibrated. The figure tilted its head slightly, a motion that sent a wave of nausea curling through his gut. Because she was afraid. The answer sent a chill through him, but it wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed the truth, afraid of what he demanded, his voice trembling between rage and desperation. Of you, silence. Then, number of what you might become. His breath caught in his throat. The symbols along the walls pulsed faster now, their rhythm no longer slow and measured, but erratic, almost frantic. A deep thrumming sound resonated through the stone beneath him, and he felt it in his bones. In the spaces between his ribs, something was waking up. The realization sent a shudder through his limbs, but he forced himself to stay still, to listen. His mind reeled, trying to piece it together, trying to make sense of the puzzle. The alien woman had abandoned him, not to die, but to be found. She had led him here, left him as an offering to something older than this world itself, but not as prey, as something else you do not understand yet. The figure's voice slithered through his skull like a whisper in the dark. But you will. And then it moved, not a step, not a slow measured shift. One moment it was standing in the darkness, the next it was right in front of him. The cavern collapsed into silence. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure loomed over him, its form barely distinguishable, a jagged silhouette against the pulsing glow of the symbols. And then slowly it raised a hand, not to strike, not to hurt, but to offer. The air grew heavy, thick, with something he couldn't name. His body trembled, but he couldn't tell if it was from fear or something else, something deeper, something familiar. A memory surfaced, fragmented, blurred at the edges, but real. The alien woman's face, the look in her eyes before she left him, not cruelty, not indifference, sorrow, regret. She had left him here because she couldn't do what needed to be done, because she couldn't be the one to face what he was meant to face, because she had known the truth before he did. And now, standing at the threshold of something vast and unknowable, he realized the truth too. He had never been abandoned, he had been chosen. The cavern pulsed with quiet energy, the symbols along the walls ebbing and flowing like the final steady beats of a dying heart. The presence before him, ancient, unknowable, remained motionless, waiting. Its outstretched hand hovered in the dim glow, a silent invitation, a choice that had already been made for him long before he arrived. Here the weight of realization settled deep into his bones. He was not meant to die in this place. He was meant to transform. The alien woman had known. She had left him here because she had seen something in him, something she feared. And yet she had returned. Why? The thought lodged itself In his mind, burrowing through the layers of exhaustion and fear that clouded his reasoning, if she had truly intended for this to happen, she would have never come back. But she had, because she had doubted, because something inside her had hoped. She was wrong. He swallowed hard. His fingers twitched at his sides. The presence in front of him did not move, did not breathe, only waited. It was patient. It had been patient for a long, long time. He thought of the others, the silent watchers on the ridge, the way they had looked at him, their expressions unreadable, their purpose unknown. Had they been waiting too? Had they known what lay in the caverns below? Had they known what he was supposed to become? His breath came slow and shallow, his heart no longer hammering in panic, but in understanding. He had spent so much time believing he had been forsaken, left to rot in a place that had no concern for him. But now he saw the truth. This place had always been waiting for him. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if sensing the shift in his thoughts. The glow of the symbol dimmed for a moment, then surged again, their pulsing rhythm falling into sync with his heartbeat. Something unseen stirred in the air, brushing against his skin like a whisper of static, and for the first time he truly felt it, the connection, the choice. Slowly he lifted his hand for a moment. Time held still, the cavern, the figure, the pulsing lights, all of it suspended in a fragile, silent it. Then contact. The instant his fingers met the figure's outstretched hand, a flood of sensation ripped through him. Not pain, not fear, but knowing. His mind cracked open, and 1,000 voices that were not voices poured into him. He saw flashes of a world not his own, skies scorched, black oceans boiling away into nothingness, great towers crumbling into dust. He saw beings like the one before him, countless in number, standing at the edge of ruin, reaching for something, someone, a savior that never came. He saw their grief, their rage, their longing, and then he saw himself, not as he was, but as something else, something more, a conduit, a vessel, a bridge between what had been and what could be again. The cavern walls trembled, the symbols burned brighter than ever, searing into his mind, carving themselves into the fabric of his existence. The presence before him was no longer separate, no longer something to be feared or understood. It was part of him now, and he was part of it. The silence shattered. A sound, not quite a roar, not quite a whisper, tore through the cavern, vibrating through his bones, through his very soul. The air folded inward, and for a moment he felt himself dissolve, felt his body break apart into something less, something infinite. Then suddenly a hand pulling him back, that different hand, warmer, familiar. The alien woman, her face was a mask of anguish, her eyes wide with something between terror and hope. She gripped his wrist, her strength trembling, but unyielding. Let go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, raw with desperation. You don't have to do this. He could barely hear her over the hum in his mind, the voices calling to him, welcoming him. He could feel them inside him now, twisting through his veins, filling every empty space. He was one of them, and yet he wasn't. Her fingers tightened, come back. His pulse pounded. She had left him, she had abandoned him. She had fed him to this place, to these beings, knowing what he would become, and yet she had come back because she had doubted, because some small part of her had hoped she was wrong. His mind was splitting, unraveling. The cavern pulsed around him, the weight of something vast and ancient pressing down, pulling him deeper, demanding he accept what he had become. But she was still holding on, still hoping. His fingers trembled. The figure before him did not move, did not resist. It did not need to. The choice had already been made, or had it? He drew a breath, and he let go, not of her, of them. The cavern convulsed, the symbols flashing in one final blinding burst of light. A soundless scream erupted in his skull, a chorus of rage, of loss, of something that had waited too long only to be denied at the last moment. The air collapsed inward, and then silence. The cavern was empty, the presence was gone. He was still standing. His breath came, ragged, his limbs weak, his body his own again. The alien woman stared at him, her face unreadable, her grip on his wrist still firm. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then finally she exhaled. You weren't supposed to resist. He met her gaze. You weren't supposed to come back. A long silence stretched between them, and then for the first time her expression softened just slightly. She let go of his wrist, and together they turned toward the path that would take them out of the dark.